Hello, this is David Wills with TED-IELTS, and today we're going to be looking at some IELTS vocabulary for the topic of crime and punishment. This is a fairly common IELTS topic, and it is most likely to occur in the writing test, although it could appear almost anywhere in the exam. We're going to learn some fairly useful vocabulary. I want to say advanced vocabulary, but it's better not to think in terms of simple and advanced vocabulary. You should always just strive for the right word for each situation. First of all, we'll look at the word criminal. As you can see, criminal can be used as both a noun and an adjective. As a noun, it refers to a person, a criminal. For example, 3 suspected criminals were arrested last night, or the criminal was apprehended after a high-speed chase. Criminal can also be an adjective, and for that we would typically put it before the noun that it describes. And it just means relating to crime, and usually it will tell you that the noun has some criminal aspect to it. For example, we can see here, we need to improve education to reduce criminal behavior in teenagers. So in this case, the behavior that these teenagers exhibit is criminal, so it is bad behavior. Likewise, the criminal mindset is what drives people to reoffend. So this mindset, their attitude, has some aspects of criminality to it. Our next word is arrest. You probably know this word. It is a verb, well, usually a verb, meaning when a police officer or another kind of authority figure captures a person that has committed a crime or is suspected of having committed a crime. Police officers have the power to arrest people suspected of criminal offenses, or the suspect was arrested and brought into custody. So we normally use we often use the passive voice with the word arrest because you don't really need to say who did the arresting in most cases. It is almost always the police. So we might say something like, the murderer was arrested. Nobody would say who arrested him. You would say, of course, it's the police. You don't need to tell people this. So the passive voice can be quite useful there. As I alluded to earlier, arrest can also be a noun. You could talk about an arrest. An arrest was made in the early hours, or we have a warrant for your arrest. We have some synonyms here. These are actually synonyms for the verb form. The ones you would probably use in IELTS are apprehend, detain, or capture. These are not exactly the same as arrest, because arrest implies by an authority figure, whereas the others may not be by an authority figure. You can see I have listed 5 informal synonyms. These are just out of interest for you. If you hear them on TV shows or movies, but they're not really appropriate for IELTS. You could say the criminal was bagged by the cops or nabbed by the cops. It's a very informal way of saying arrested. To pull in, to pinch, or to bust are the same. You often hear bust for criminals getting in trouble. So here are 3 similar words: imprison, jail, and incarcerate. So these are all verbs. In this case, they're all verbs. And it all means to put or keep in prison or a place like prison. We'll come back to the difference between prison and jail later. So an example, repeat offenders should be imprisoned for the protection of society, or we could say incarcerated or jailed for the protection of society. So it means just to take these people that have done something bad and put them away for their crime. Some other versions of this, and again, these are a little informal, although I would say they're mostly okay for IELTS writing. To put behind bars, you could say to put the criminal behind bars. To lock up, to put away, or to send to prison. They're definitely a little less formal than imprison, jail, or incarcerate, but they're not extremely informal. I think you could use these. Right, I mentioned the difference between prison and jail. So prison, this is where serious criminals go for quite a long time. So it's an institution for people that have gone to court and been prosecuted and found guilty, and they need to go to prison for, 6 months or a year or 20 years, depending on their crime. Jail, on the other hand, is a little more temporary. Some people go to jail to wait while they are sentenced for a crime. And other people, they might be sentenced to go to jail for a short period of time rather than go to prison, which is more serious. So jail is usually a short-term minor thing, whereas prison is long-term serious thing. So our example sentences: he's been sentenced to 4 years in prison, or she spent 2 days in jail before her trial. So capital punishment. This is something you often see come up in task 2 of the IELTS writing test. And some people might wonder what that means exactly. Basically, it means the death penalty or execution. It is when the state, the government, decides to basically kill a person because they're a criminal, usually. An example: no society that calls itself advanced should practice capital punishment. It is not humane to execute people, even for the most extreme crimes. So you can see there we say practice capital punishment. You could say carry out capital punishment or engage in capital punishment. And you can see that I've changed the noun execution into the verb execute. This verb execute can actually be used in different ways. It doesn't always mean to kill. In computer technology, it means to do something. Here are 3 related words: court, justice, and judge. So a court, it could be a place, or we usually refer to it as a place, but technically it's the body of people presided over by a judge, judges, or magistrate, and acting as a tribunal in civil or criminal cases. Although, as I mentioned, a lot of people do think of it as the place. In fact, the place is usually the courthouse, so it's the house where the court is. In any case, I think you can get away with using that interchangeably. So justice is kind of another way of saying fairness or equality. It is about the carrying out of the laws of a country. A judge is a person, and they are appointed by the government or the public, depending on where you live. You can see the definition here: a public officer appointed to decide cases in a court of law. So they are usually in charge of the court, and they make the final decision. Although you may have a jury, that's a group of people making the decision of whether someone is guilty or innocent. Next, we have a sort of common confusion, and to be honest, this is something I think most native speakers of English don't know. It's not terribly important, but I will explain this here in case you find this useful. The important word is at the top: lawyer. This is a person who practices or studies law. But you may have heard these 2 other terms: solicitor and attorney. These are kind of the British and American terms for lawyer, but there is some distinction. So in the UK, we talk about a solicitor. This is basically a lawyer, somebody that practices law. However, this person is basically involved in creating or reviewing legal documents rather than fighting in a court. In the US, an attorney is what we normally think of as a lawyer. So all attorneys are lawyers, but not all lawyers are attorneys. You can see the definition: someone appointed to act for another person or group in business or legal matters. I would say for IELTS, because the distinctions between these are quite technical and not well known, I think you can use any of these words interchangeably. Right, our last words for today are rehabilitate and reform. So to rehabilitate means to restore someone to health in many regards, but it can also be other senses. And obviously we're talking about crime and punishment. Well, you can rehabilitate a prisoner or a criminal. So that means to give them help to live a life without crime. And reform is basically the same thing, meaning getting someone to give up that life of crime. It doesn't have to be life of crime. Reform and rehabilitate could also be used for people that are doing lots of drugs or alcohol or other destructive things. We often talk about how people are punished or treated after they've committed crimes. And of course, many of them go to prison, but once they come out of prison, they have a very difficult life. And so we might wonder what prisons can do to help people and to make sure they don't commit more crimes and then come back to prison again. And so we get into the idea of rehabilitation. So you might have a sentence like this in one of your IELTS essays: the aim of a prison system should be, at least in part, to reform offenders so they can rejoin normal society. Or we ought to focus on rehabilitating young criminals to give them a chance to contribute to their communities. Well, we could keep going all day with lots more vocabulary, but that is enough for this lesson. I have an article on my website all about crime and punishment with sample essays and some information about the speaking test too to help you. If you want to learn more vocabulary about crime and punishment, you can watch the news, because there's always a lot of stuff about crime there. Or you can read some articles like on the BBC News app. When you do, I suggest you find a word that is new to you, like defendant or prosecuting or prosecution, and you can then Google it to see how it is used. You'll see multiple definitions, you can see some examples, and you can find out whether it's a common word or not. And that can help you to learn. Right, that's enough for me today. I'll see you again next week for another helpful IELTS video. Goodbye, folks.